Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Well, have you all had those that were here yesterday, I hope you had a good sleep and good rest, because you're in for the long haul again today. Welcome back, and welcome to our new visitors today that weren't here today. You're certainly in for a treat, because today we're going to sort of end. Each speaker will take today to another higher level and really end on a climax. And I'm looking forward to each and every one of our speakers here and our guests today. So, a very special occasion, Megalithomania, South Africa, Johannesburg, 13th of March, 2011, the conclusion of what we've started, of planting the seeds of higher consciousness and the expansion of knowledge. So to introduce our first speaker and our guest today, as you may have noticed from our program, we've changed the format a little bit. To continue his phenomenal research and fabulous information that I absolutely love, Hugh Newman, about the ancient American civilizations, the Olmecs and all the cultures associated around those American civilizations. So please put your hand together for the conclusion of Hugh Newman's spectacular work. Hugh Newman.
Thank you very much, Michael. Another rousing introduction. So today, rather than talk about just Mesoamerica and the ancient civilizations of that part of the world, we're going to be looking at the entire planet from a geodetic and from an Earth grid's perspective, and how the ancients worked with these particular energies and with these sites across the entire surface of the globe. This is just the introductory image here, but you can see how complicated these grids can get. And we've focused here on Africa, just to give you some idea. Here's the book which this talk is going to be based on, with a bit of extra research thrown in. And you can get this on Amazon and on our megalithomania.co.uk website. Unfortunately, we've sold out here, so you can't get them here, I'm afraid. And here's just it's just an outline of the contents of this lecture, just to get you tuned up to what I'm going to be discussing for the next hour. But what really we're looking at here, as well as this kind of list, is the idea that there was a global civilization in prehistory who understood where we were on the planet and were able to survey and mark the surface of the planet with ancient sites. For whatever reason, we're not sure, but we're going to look at some ideas today. And also, we're going to look really at ley lines, or lays, as Alfred Watkins termed them back in the 1920s, which is simply an alignment of numerous sites over whatever distance you choose. But some of these, it's now been realized, since we've been able to map the planet more carefully, is that some of them go all the way around the planet and actually are great circles around the entire circumference. Well, also, when you look at grids and earth energies and lays, you really have to look at sacred geometry and the platonic solids, because the earth is more or less a sphere, and some of these grids fit into these principles wholeheartedly. Also, some ancient maps give some clues as well. But first of all, I'd really like to dedicate this to John Michell, who was the inspiration for Megalithomania. He wrote the book called Megalithomania in 1982. And he was one of the visionaries who came up with many of the ideas to do with global earth grids and earth energies and ley lines. And I think this passage from the book, The View Over Atlantis, is an extremely good example of what we're going to be looking at today. So I'm going to read this out word for word just in honor of John Michell. A great scientific instrument lies sprawled over the entire surface of the globe. At some time, perhaps it was over 4,000 years ago, almost every corner of the world was visited by a group of men who came with a particular task to accomplish. With the help of some remarkable power by which they could cut and raise enormous blocks of stone, these men erected vast astronomical instruments, circles of erect pillars, pyramids, underground tunnels, cyclopean alignments, whose course from horizon to horizon was marked by stones, mounds, and earthworks. The vast scale of prehistoric engineering is not yet generally recognized. John Michell from The View Over Atlantis, that was published in 1969. And so first of all, let's look at the prehistory of the potential of a global civilization and earth grids. The Pires Res map is a very good example, which was a map from 1513, and it's got many incomprehensible grid lines all over it. And it was put together from many other ancient maps in Alexandria around that time. And Professor Charles Hapgood of Keene State College, New Hampshire, spent 7 years working on this and believed, because Antarctica was mapped free of ice, that it must be thousands, if not 10,000 years old, because Antarctica was only free of ice back in that era. And so pieces of these old maps were obviously congregated by Admiral Pires Res, and he came up with this. And also the Giza alignment, which is like the prime meridian, as Graham Hancock mentioned last night, the prime meridian really shouldn't be going through Greenwich or Paris or anything like that. It should be going through Giza. It should be going through that part of Africa, because that's the geodetic center of the planet. And there's another map just below there, Orontius Finicus map from 1532. And this, again, backs up this idea that they were mapping the world in extremely ancient times, because it shows clearly the coastline of Antarctica again. And this again suggests an extremely prehistoric date. There are many more examples than that, which I cover in the book. And now we come to a very interesting creation myth of the Hopi. And this is like fascinating, because this goes way back into their prehistory. And this is a graphic interpretation of it, but basically the creator, or Taiwa, assigned Spider Grandmother Woman, which is this lady here, as guardian for the earth. And she spat into 2 handfuls of earth, and 2 men were created, Polagahoya and Pogagahoya. They sat in meditation to link minds, and energy was sent to the north and south poles. They heard a distant, slow rhythm from the heartbeat of Taiwa, and they started beating on a magical drum to create energetic, cymatic geometry out through the planet. This energy hit the navel of the Earth, and then it shot down to the center of the Earth and bounced back to the surface, where these power spots or power centers all over the planet formed. And that's what and the Hopis called this spots of the fawn. You may have heard this legendary creation myth before. But first of all, before we sort of start looking at other ancient references to the grid, I think we need just to go off planet for a little while and have a look at Mars. Because a lot of the research carried out, the studies of Mars by Richard Hoagland and other researchers, realized that there were geometries going on actually aligning certain what looked like ancient sites and pyramids and the face on Mars actually on the surface of the planet. And they kept working away at the geometry, and Richard Hoagland got access to many of these different photos. And he realized the same angle kept popping up between different pyramids, between different structures, and it was always 19.47 degrees or 19.5 degrees. And he realized that was the geometry, or that was the latitude. If you place a tetrahedron in a sphere, and the points where it touched the surface are 19.5 degrees above or below the equator, depending on which way you put the tetrahedron in it. And he noticed that on Mars, the Olympus Mons volcanoes, which are the largest in the solar system, sit exactly at that latitude. So he suggested that maybe points of a tetrahedron were being mapped on the surface of the planet as well. Now, this also happens on Earth. We have Hawaii, and the great volcano complex there sits at 19.5 degrees. And also we get examples on other planets too. There were dark cloud bands around Saturn at 19.5 degrees, and there's the highest solar flare activity on the sun, again, at this latitude. Jupiter's red spot sits at 22.5 degrees, which is exactly a quadrant distance. And the great dark spot on Neptune sits at 22.5 degrees as well. So we're noticing correspondences between certain different points, and we'll come back to these as we move along. But if we have a look at Miranda, which is Uranus's moon, there's some fascinating geometries that are simply on the planet's surface. And you can clearly see hexagonal and pentagonal geometry here. And on the lower images, you can see triangular geometry, which would correspond to faces of an icosahedron. And also on Saturn itself, the North Pole has this very strange hexagonal sort of cymatic energy system floating around on top of the planet. And you've got this is actually This area here is twice the size of Earth. So it's huge, and it sits there and doesn't budge. And as all the cloud bands and the planet kind of rotates, that maintains its integrity as though there's some kind of geometrical energetic effect permanently there. And this was only discovered in 1982. Here's just another image of it. So you can see it more close up and the way the cloud bands appear to move around it. This image here is from Iapetus, which is Saturn's moon, and it's got a clear ridge going perfectly around the center of it, all the way around the planet, all the way around the circumference, and it's 12 miles wide and 12 miles high, as though it's a great wall that's been built around this particular moon. And so with this in mind, with all these geometries and perfect kind of mathematical features appearing throughout our solar system, we must suggest, at least speculatively, if not scientifically, that these energetic upwellings and anomalies should be present on Earth too. So this is the Earth with this is a dodecahedral image overlaid onto the Earth. And this was put together by some Russian scientists in the early 1970s who realized that perhaps that the mid-Atlantic ridge looks a little bit like the shape or one side of a dodecahedron. And also we know that from ancient times, Plato once said that the Earth, when viewed from above, resembles a ball sewn from 12 pieces of skin. And this would resemble a dodecahedron. And on the right-hand side there you have a dodecahedron, but this is from 4000 BC in Scotland, Britain. And many of these geometries were found and were made by the Neolithic people. Their purpose is unknown, but we'll have a look at some ideas about them a little later. This just shows you the Earth again. It's supposed to unfold into an interesting geometry, but it hasn't. This next image is some work that was done by Ivan T. Sanderson, again in the late 60s, early 1970s. And he was an interesting guy. He was a biologist and a paranormal researcher who did a lot of research into aliens and underwater UFO activity. And one of the things he came up with, he wanted to check out places around the world where strange anomalies, disappearances, flight craft, magnetic, gravitational effects were happening. And he did tons of research, done a huge amount of analysis, and came up with certain points around the planet where it happened more than others. And he came up with 12 points, which are called the violet vortices. These ones on the screen here, plus the North and South Pole. But what he didn't realize, before we move on, just check this out. This is the Bermuda Triangle. This is like the famous one. We've got an interesting one down here, very close to where we are here. I don't know if any people here have got any research on any strange activities. It'd be very interesting to see. Other one in North Africa. And obviously over here, we've got Easter Island and Hawaii, which both have had very similar activities, and also the Devil's Triangle off the coast of Japan as well. But what he didn't realize until much later was that all these occurrences and strange phenomena were happening at points on an Earth grid, an icosahedral Earth grid, which is this shape here, which has got 20 triangular faces perfectly represented by these strange anomalies across the planet. And this just shows you a close-up here of the area of the famous Bermuda Triangle. So, as this research developed in the early 70s, well, before we do that, I just want to show you an image of South Africa with the icosahedron. And you can see these are the shapes of the icosahedron here. Oh, in fact, I think that's actually an octahedron, so we'll come back to that shortly. At the same time, Ivan Sanderson was doing his research in the early 70s. Some Russian scientists were doing similar stuff, but what they were doing, they believed, this is quite a strange thing for a bunch of sophisticated professors and scientists to come up with, but they believed that the Earth, millions of years ago, was actually a great crystal with a certain geometry, that through millions of years of spin came up, and Earth kind of came from the cosmos and the solar system and formed upon it, which created the surface of the Earth we know today. And they believed that evidence or energetic upwellings from that crystal that's still inside the Earth are still detectable on the surface. And they came up with this whole idea that there was a dodecahedron energy system and an icosahedron energy system forming within the planet. And these are the geometries you can see here. That's the dodecahedron with 12 faces, and that's the icosahedron with 20 triangular faces. And here's the combination of them. And these were just some early maps they came up with. This just shows you another image of that. And it looks more like a sort of net over the planet, but it gives a good example of how it looks. And then we have this image here again. This is the icosahedron overlaid using modern Google Earth. But also there's an alignment which you may notice and you may recognize from Michael Tellinger's work, which is the alignment from area around Adam's calendar all the way up to Giza. And this virtually follows the dead center of this particular triangular face and corresponds to the dodecahedron and the icosahedron. This white line we'll be discussing later. And so we see that there's a correlation immediately from a geodetic perspective between Adam's calendar and the Giza pyramids and the Earth grid. Also, around the late 70s, but he was researching this actually from the 1960s, is Bruce Cathy, who was a New Zealand airline pilot. And he kept seeing UFOs when he was flying. He kept having all these revelations, and he had so many sightings, he decided to correlate exactly where these sightings had taken place. And he got everyone else in the country to mark and GPS where these had occurred and which direction these UFOs were moving in. Within a few years, he came up with this map on the right-hand side and realized there was a particular grid system with grid squares 30 nautical miles apart. And then at the same time this was happening, he discovered a researcher in France called Aimé Michel, who was finding the same anomalies. There was UFO flight paths appear to be 30 nautical miles apart. And he had a revelation and got a plastic ball and drew lines all over it and realized what he'd discovered was a potential Earth grid. But what he later realized, which he didn't really document too much himself, was that he'd found a cube octahedron, like a combination of an octahedron and a cube grid system. He also pinpointed this strange looking object at the bottom of the sea off the coast of Cape Horn in South America. And he believed it was some kind of alien or ancient civilization's antenna that had been placed there as an Earth grid marker point. But it was later realized it was actually a deep sea sponge called Charisma, unfortunately. And so that kind of, a lot of people discredited him for that. But actually, Bruce Cathy's research is hugely important, and it's well worth looking at his books. He also found 3 different grids using the same cube octahedron system with 3 different north and south poles slightly alternating as though it kind of moved a little bit. And he believes that the ancient aliens were actually working and using the energy from this grid to actually power their crafts and actually propel themselves back into space. So this just shows you the octahedron in yellow overlaid with the dodecahedron. And you can see the way the grid starts to form. And you can, again, we'll keep coming back to this, you can see the way that this line between the small pyramids at Adam's calendar and the great pyramids in Giza seem to align yet again. This was later developed by William Becker and Beth Hargens, who were professors at a university in New England. And they came up with this map, which is called the Unified Vector Geometry System. Later, they changed the name to the Rings of Gaia because it was a bit easier to digest. But it's basically the same system as the Russians had developed and Ivan Sanderson had instigated. And it also incorporated Bruce Cathy's research as well. But they had to adjust it slightly and bring more energy or kind of more ribs into it so it would hold together as a geodetic structure. And they used some of the formulas from Buckminster Fuller to bring it all together. But actually it's very simple. It's basically a rhombic triicontahedron combined with all 5 platonic solids. And if you look carefully at some of these points, I'll just point a few out to you which are very interesting. For example, down here we have this area off the coast of South America, and you can see clearly the way the land seems to shape around that particular point. And you get the same thing as well in Australia. Look here, there's a point there, precisely. And then, of course, you have this one. Now, this is open to interpretation exactly where the one is in South Africa. And it's a very important subject that we're going to start looking at because it's not that far from Great Zimbabwe, it's not that far from Adam's calendar, and it's not far from many of the sites that Michael Tellinger and Johann Hein have been researching. But the exact location of it, it seems that these grid points actually stretch over a very large area, and they're not just a particular stone circle site, for example. They're actually a great area, and they spread out into the landscape. And you can see in Britain, there's a line that goes right through the center here. And this is, again, this just shows the prime meridian of the planet, going through Giza down to these sites here. And you can see the Bermuda Triangle there. And over this side here, you can see Easter Island, Hawaii rather, in the middle of the Pacific, and Easter Island down here. And so again, you can see all these correlations turn up. But this line here particularly interests me. This seems to be like the prime meridian. It fits in with the grid system. Everything in the grid system is based around that prime meridian. That seems to be the sort of the anchor of it. This is something that you'll notice the more you look into the distribution of ancient sites around the planet. They're all related to Giza. This is the European grid, and it just shows you one of the old graphics that was put together by William Becker and Beth Hargens. And what they did, they carried on using Buckminster Fuller's research and actually sort of put more lines between them and joined the dots, basically. And they came up with a very tight, complicated grid around the whole planet, which gets a bit weird, actually, because you get to a point where virtually you can get thousands of ancient sites fitting onto a grid if they're very tight, if the lines of the grid are very tightly placed. So you have to go in researching this with a little bit of discernment and looking at the different eras that these sites were placed at. This just shows you the grid system from Google Earth. You can actually get this program from Google, from the internet. Just type in William Becker and Beth Hargens, Beth with an E on the end, and Google UVG grid, and you should be able to find this program. You can overlay actually over Google Earth for free. It's all free. And she sent me a copy of that, and I've been working on it ever since, about for the last 6 or 7 years. This just shows you the grid system over Britain, and lots of sites seem to occur. I mean, there's the famous Michael line, for instance, which fits precisely, almost precisely, with the Earth grid system here. And this is a very famous ley line that goes all the way around the planet, and we saw an example of that yesterday, which is the global version of that. It's called the Rainbow Serpent. We'll come on to that shortly. This shows you a grid system, an earlier image over America. And again, you can see this area here, the Bermuda Triangle, the tip of the Bermuda Triangle around this area. Over here, there's some interesting, over in the southwest, the point there, you can see that there's some very interesting rock art that go back, and there's a Hohokam tribe which go back 10,000 years. And so it's a very interesting place, that area there. And I actually went to visit it and tried to find evidence of a particular site that may be on that grid point, but found again that it was a whole area, really, over several, maybe 10 or 20 miles, covering a whole area and lots of different sites within that. This just shows you one of the faces, really, of what's called the rhombic triicontohedron. And even though it's quite a complicated way of saying it, you can see on the right-hand side, it's a very nice way of looking at it. And I like the way this geometry kind of works on the planet, and it really does fit in when you start looking at the placement of ancient sites around the planet too. And you can see these kind of faces here, which have a bit that sort of sticks out like a truncated area around the center here. And this just shows you an example over the Americas. This just shows you Britain, but what we've done with this image, we've got the grid in the lighter grey colour, and I'm sorry it's not all in colour, but the book is a black and white book. We've got the main grid in the lighter shade of grey, and then the darker shades are major ley lines that run through Britain. And we've also added these two circular effects. They're called the circles of perpetual choirs that were actually discovered by John Michell. And they're not actually circular, they're actually 10-sided, kind of almost like ley lines, but they're circular, like ley circles, going in huge circles, which take in many ancient sites, such as Stonehenge and Avebury and other such places. And if we zoom in to an area in Wiltshire and Somerset, we get what's called the Wessex Astrum. And this was a discovery by Peter Knight and Tony Perrott, the book of the same name, the Wessex Astrum. It's an absolutely fascinating book. But what they discovered, and they didn't even realize the implications of this discovery until I pointed out some of the grid research. This line here is basically that same alignment we saw on the grid, and it's the St. Michael line. And this one here is an alignment that goes from Stonehenge to this place called Brockley, but it continues and it goes all the way up to where the Stonehenge bluestones were taken from, and it goes right through the area in Wales, over 150 miles away, so 120 miles away, where the bluestones were taken from and brought to Stonehenge, as though they were marking something on a map showing these different points. This shows you an example of what we're looking at here. This lower dotted triangle that goes from Stonehenge to Lundy Island to the Bluestone site is basically what we were looking at. You can see here, this is the alignment here, going from Stonehenge to Brockley, bottom right to top left. That is the same alignment as this alignment here from Stonehenge to the Bluestone site, exactly the same. So we're seeing many correlations turn up from different people's research that haven't actually shared their communication here. And also this line actually goes around the entire planet. It goes all the way through some amazing sites in Ireland. It goes through the Ohio Serpent Mound, goes all the way around the planet through Mecca and through Giza, and then back to Stonehenge. So we're looking at a great Earth circle and the first evidence that perhaps the builders of these sites were actually mapping the planet in antiquity. Some other discoveries in this image from Robin Heath. He discovered these different great triangles and these surveying. Was this larger triangle, this 3-4-5 triangle, which links this major site in Anglesey on the top left with Arborough on the top right and down to Stonehenge. And you can see that it's a perfect 3-4-5 triangle over a great landscape. And this is a Pythagorean triangle, which is obviously part of their surveying technique, which was being used way before Pythagoras. This is just a graphic that shows the distance from Giza to a place called Newgrange in Ireland. Now, Newgrange is like the huge, super ancient, probably 6,000 or 7,000 BC prehistoric temple, megalithic temple in Ireland, which is aligned precisely to the winter solstice and is famous for that. And it's brilliantly, superbly built. It's a megalithic mastery really at work here. And it's one of the oldest sites in Europe. But what you do, if you draw a line between Giza and Newgrange, it is absolutely precisely 1/10 of the planetary circumference. It's absolutely down to within 100 meters, I think. And so we're seeing, was that deliberately done? Were they mapping the planet in prehistory? And why were they doing that? What was the purpose behind it? Again, we have to come back to Giza to kind of find some answers here. And this map here just shows you where the original prime meridian really should be, going through the Giza area. Partly the reason is because it's got the most landmass in all directions going from Giza. And this was proposed in the 1880s by Charles Piazzi Smythe, who was the Royal Astronomer of Scotland, to actually have this as the prime meridian rather than England and rather than France. Unfortunately, England won that, and now it goes through Greenwich, which is an arbitrary, useless alignment. But when it goes through Giza, you realize that all the ancient sites around the planet are taken from that particular alignment, and you can see many examples occur as we look through different areas of research and we look at the placement of these sites. This is just an interesting graphic from Graham Hancock's book, Heaven's Mirror. And we rejigged it for our Earth Grids book. And again, this is he mentioned this yesterday, and this is pointing to the fact that many sites, when taken east or west of this Giza meridian, harmonic intervals, i.e. 72 degrees, 144 degrees, 108 degrees, all these different angles keep turning up. And we must remember that they're not only processional numbers encoded, they're also pentagonal numbers encoded as well, as you can see on this graphic here. And so we started to notice that perhaps they somehow had a GPS device that worked in prehistory. I mean, I call it GPS BC, because I think there's something going on here. They obviously knew where they were on the planet precisely, and they were able to work this to their benefit when traveling around the planet. Here's just some examples of some distances from the Giza meridian. For example, Baalbek in Lebanon is exactly 5 degrees east. Angkor Wat, again, as Graham mentioned, is 72 degrees east. Chavin de Huntwa in Peru is 108 degrees west. which is like a shamanic megalithic temple complex. The Paracas Trident, again, is 108 degrees west. Tiwanaku is exactly 100 degrees west. And there's many more examples down the left-hand side there. And these are all from the prime meridian of Giza. And on the right-hand side, we've got longitudinal distances between sites. So forget Giza. So from Easter Island to Angkor Wat is 144 degrees. And another example further down, which I find particularly interesting, is the Bosnian pyramids, which I don't know if you're aware of. A huge pyramid complex in Bosnia has been discovered. And if that to Machu Picchu in Peru is exactly 90 degrees from it. So we're looking at a quadrant distance. And there's many different examples. These are all covered in the book and on obviously on the DVD. So let's have another look at this. This is a particularly interesting alignment. Not only this one here, but it's this one here I really want to look at. It's the White Great Circle, which was discovered by Jim Allenton about 10 years ago. Now this was just, he was just researching different ancient sites, but he came across this particular one, which really grabbed my attention because it goes through an incredible amount of absolutely magnificent megalithic temples and ancient sites. It goes through Nazca in Peru and Machu Picchu in Peru, to Sali in North Africa, just around this area, Siwa, which is Egypt, Giza, Ur, in the Sumerian area, all the way around to Angkor Wat in Cambodia, then to Easter Island and many other sites on it as well. So we're looking at some major ancient sites. And this precisely cuts the Earth in two. It's almost like it was perhaps a prehistoric equator that they used as their equator. So I just wanted to show you that as a little bit of interesting research from another author. And then we come back to these. These absolutely fascinate me because these have been discovered mainly in Scotland, but in other parts of Northern Europe too. And you can clearly see these images across the bottom here. This is a photo of some of these. About the size, you can hold them in your hand. Some of them are made of extremely hard granite and different types of basalt. And they're perfectly, good representations of the 5 different platonic solids. Now, these shouldn't exist 3000 BC in England. Plato hadn't even been born then. He wasn't going to be born for another 2,000 years. And so we can't even call them platonic solids anymore. We should call them prehistoric polyhedra or something. But these are some other ones that have been discovered. These are the classic 5 platonic solids, as you're probably all aware. And these ones, look at these. Absolutely beautiful, beautiful carvings. And on the one on the right kind of grabs my attention because it's almost like it's showing, yes, there is a grid system around the planet. They could have been representing these representations of the planet. And this is something that Keith Critchlow believed they could have well been used for. He actually said in his book, Time Stands Still, and Keith Critchlow is a master geometer. He suggested that they were used by the ancients to study spherical geometry of the planet. And so it could be one of the reasons. And also, when you combine these 5 different platonic solids and put them into one solid itself, Keith Critchlow deduced this, and he came up with this, which is an almost perfect representation of the planetary grid. So is there a connection there? Now, there are other grids as well, not just these ones we've been looking at that contain these different platonic and geometric solids. There's actually some much tighter ones that occur all over the planet, just a few meters apart, some of them, called the Hartmann and the Curry grids. And this graphic here just shows you how close they are with a house and a person represented on there. And these actually have quite an effect on us and can cause something called geopathic stress, which is something that Feng Shui experts and geomancers work with. And they actually realize that often these lines, if the landscape isn't correctly worked with, and houses and structures are just built randomly, it actually disrupts all the energy of the local landscape and actually can cause harm to individuals who live at the wrong, at the wrong part of where it should be. Whereas in ancient China, and I think in ancient Europe too, possibly the whole planet, they had this high understanding of these energies because they were tuned in. They didn't have TV and distractions and 9-to-5 jobs. They were able to tune into these energies and keep everything in harmony and keep their whole lives working in a harmonic manner. And so I think this is something we've lost and we're now just starting to regain through the art and science of geomancy. And many of these particular points, so for example, if your bed is on a crossing point of some stressed energy lines because of, it could even be from a house a few miles away. If the energy isn't flowing properly and your bed is on two crossing point, you can actually cause really bad diseases like cancer and different really nasty things. And actually it's even killed people, it's been discovered. So it's really worth getting hold of your local geomancer and checking out your place. Usually you can tell, if you tuned in any way, you can tell, but sometimes it's worth getting a second opinion because often it's just the placement of your bed and your house and the stuff within it which can cause the problems. Now this is something that people like my friend Sean Kerwin, who's an expert geomancer, the late Hamish Miller, and many other people have been working on for decades. And it's certainly a subject worth looking into. This is a guy called, I've completely forgotten his name, sorry about that, a French researcher that I was working with a couple of years ago. And he found these particular Hartmann and Curry grids that can have this positive or negative effect on you, depending on the system. He found that many ancient sites, what happens is, these Hartmann and Curry grids, there's almost like a force field around these ancient sites that stop the Hartmann and Curry grids getting to the ancient site. And this is like a breakthrough, really, because what he's realized is, so these ancient sites are like neutral places, completely neutral energy. It's almost like that could be what makes it sacred, because it's got a neutral energy, and you go in there and there's pure energy without any interference from anything around you. And this is something he came up with, and it is also works with different types of electromagnetism, like electric charge and magnetic fluctuations. And when there's no Hartmann and Curry grid, you can have a very positive and altered state of consciousness effect when this is done a certain way. This is something we'll look a little bit more into this and the effects of these ancient sites and these types of earth energies. These energies seem to also go around the planet, coming back to this idea of a global grid. We saw this yesterday. This is the Great Rainbow Serpent energy current. I just want to point out some things on here for you. You can see this is the Britain area, and this is the great extension of the Michael and Mary line. It goes all the way around the planet. It goes through Lake Titicaca, all the way around here. Many sites on it. You can have a good look at this. And then the other one is called the Plume Serpent, which sort of goes through the Americas, under Africa, and back up through the east side, far east. And these are particularly interesting because this is something that caught my attention, partly because these are two great currents that go around the Earth, and partly because what Robert Kuhn, the discoverer, believed they were like actual chakra points of the planet, and that these were important sites and actually were worked with by the ancients for many hundreds, if not thousands of years. And it seems like, this is something Hamish Miller, the master geomancer, pointed out when he was researching through Britain and Europe, that he believed these lines, these energy lines, are made up of hundreds of different frequencies that were somehow brought together and manipulated by humans to flow in certain paths in the same way that you'd shape a riverbank so it flowed where you wanted it to flow. He believed that the ancients were doing it with these energies. For exactly what reasons, we're still unsure of, but we're starting to get some ideas. This next image just shows you where the main chakra points are on the planet. And this is it's a fantastic website called rainbowserpentproject.com, run by Tor Webster. He's been developing the ideas of Robert Kuhn. And this just shows you where some of them are. This is the British version of that rainbow serpent. This is the famous Michael and Mary Earth energy currents. Now, just so you know, there was a straight line alignment that was discovered by John Michell back in the late 60s called the St. Michael line. And that just goes across the whole country. It was one straight line alignment, many sites dedicated to St. Michael. Then Hamish Miller and Paul Broadhurst went out dowsing with the dowsing rods. I've actually got some rods out front if anyone wants to try out any. And he found these two great energy currents weaving like a caduceus around this straight line alignment, all the way up through the whole length of the St. Michael line, the whole width of England. Now, what's interesting with this is that they realized it probably does go around the world, but they just spent 10 years mapping this and walking these lines. So they weren't really up for continuing for another 50 years going around the planet. So I took the initiative and went to South America, where these energy currents were supposed to go through. They were supposed to go through the island of the sun in Lake Titicaca, and it's also where it crossed with the plume serpent as well. You remember that? Oh, I'll show you another image shortly just to remind you. But the blue line, the light blue line, through the center there, going through the center of the island, the light one, that shows the exact straight extension of the St. Michael line from England. And the red and the red and the blue lines on either side of the screen, they show you where the Michael line there and the Mary line on the bottom, they show you where the energy lines sort of move in and around like a caduceus. And at this particular point, they're quite far apart, but then they come back again on the mainland of Bolivia and Peru. And I found ancient sites exactly on the points on the north and south of the island where they crossed with the plume serpent energy line. So suddenly I found all these correlations on that particular island, which completely blew my mind and really gives some kind of clout to the idea that these are global Earth energy currents. This was where the Michael Earth energy line went through, for instance, this great dolmen type structure. It's also got this huge stone underneath it, and you can actually see that kind of underneath the main dolmen table. There's a huge stone actually embedded into the ground there with these unusual square blocks nearby. And then we have the Michael energy path. It actually goes through the dolmen and goes through what appears, if you look carefully, like a great frog effigy at the back. And underneath the chin of the frog, I don't know if you have to sort of use your imagination slightly here, underneath that chin of the frog there, you can actually, lots of offerings are still being made by the Inca tribes of that area. And this is where several of these lines cross and create this kind of energy vortex. This is where it goes through on the southern part of the island, this old gateway that was possibly built by the Incas. And in the background, you have the island of the moon, where the lines don't quite go through. So we're coming back here. So this, again, shows you what we were looking at. And you can see clearly the second chakra, sexual lake Titicaca. This point here in South America, on the bottom left of the screen, shows you where all these lines converge. And this is what I went and actually dowsed and discovered there. So I was completely blown away by that. But you can see clearly that the line that goes through the Americas also goes through the whole Mexico and Guatemala region. And so I decided to go to Mexico last year to check out, to see if I could find this particular plume serpent energy current. And so I first of all went to check out the sites in and around Coatlicocos and the Olmec heartland, which is at the area on the top left there with a little pin stuck into it, and found that this energy line, plume serpent energy line, comes in through Coatlicocos. And the Coatlicocos, as I pointed out yesterday, is actually another name for serpent sanctuary. And this is the area where Quetzalcoatl, the great ancient god of all ancient cultures of Mexico, turned up. It's also the place where he departed on a raft of serpents, which whatever that might be. And then this line goes through La Venta, which is an incredible site I talked about yesterday, one of the Olmec sites. It goes through Tortuguero and Palenque, which is a famous site, and all the way down to Capan in the bottom right of the screen there. You can see that the way that the whole line kind of moves through that part of Central America. Now, this is just one of the lines. I think there's two that weave around each other, but I haven't had a chance to research that yet, so I need to go back there and see if I can find that. This is just a close-up of that particular area. This is La Venta, where these energy lines go through, and you could clearly, if you've got a pair of dowsing rods, you can clearly find these energy lines quite easily if you get trained up by a decent geomancer. Now, what are these energy lines? This is the question. We've seen the grid. We know that that could be more of a mapping system, but there seems to be energy all around the planet as well that seems to harmonize into natural kind of geometries. The top part there shows the magnetic field, and this is a NASA interpretation of the magnetic field, and the bottom part shows how the sun affects the magnetic field and causes the field lines of the planet to really surge and change, especially as our part of the planet rotates into the sunshine, i.e. the morning. This just shows you how the magnetic field seems to work, and there seems to be some kind of magnet in the middle, which is still speculative, and there's a crop circle from Wiltshire from a few years ago that shows this how this kind of energy works. This just shows you the magnetic field lines around the planet. And you can imagine if they had something to organize them into a coherent pattern, then it would actually turn into a kind of geometric grid, because this is something that people like Hans Jenny have been working on for decades. and other researchers like John Reed. And they've realized that when you vibrate matter with different sound frequencies, it actually forms into different geometries the higher up the frequency scale you go. And so perhaps with all this relentless noise going on around the planet, there's lots of noise that goes on between the Earth's surface and the ionosphere called spherics, tweaks, and whistlers. There's all these different sound effects that cause this symphony, as well as the Earth's hum. There's all these ring-like oscillations that just appear out of the Earth from nothing. There's the Schumann resonance, and there's all the lightning and thunder. There's the movement of what's happening under the planet. And it seems like the music of the spheres, like the music of the Earth. There may be a harmonic symphony going on there, but we just can't comprehend it because our ears are only tuned to certain frequencies and certain levels of sound. And so there's something to be said about this. And this is something that the Beth Hagens believed was certainly the case in her early research on Earth grids. Then we come to the orb phenomenon, ancient sites. Now, everyone seems to get photos of these orbs wherever they go nowadays, possibly partly to do with the type of camera we're using, or it could be simply because the veil is thinning and we're actually picking up spirits and sprites and different energies that we couldn't before. But some scientific research has been done on these orbs, and people have questioned where they came from. And there's a guy called John Burke and Kaj Halberg. And John Burke, unfortunately, died last year. But it's a superb book, and it's really worth getting if you can. And it describes how many of these orbs are actually electric charge signatures that come from the Earth itself. And many of these sites are placed on these magnetic or gravitational anomalies all around the planet. And actually, they were using these energies for different purposes. His theory was that this electric charge that you can see photographed, these orbs and these strips, bands of plasma, you can see clearly that he found quite easily that when you place seeds there, because he also is in the seed agriculture business, he decided to test these old legends that when people turn up, make offerings at these sites, and then go and plant their crops, they get more yield than they would if they didn't put their seeds inside these ancient megalithic sites. And it's quite a simple thing. So he did lots and lots of tests all around the planet, and his results were remarkable. Almost every ancient site, usually the oldest site in the area, when you placed your seeds there, you'd get results because of these magnetic anomalies, or what he called conductivity discontinuities, where different types of geology meet. And it creates a shift in the magnetism and a shift in the electric charge. I mean, check out this big orb next to this huge dolmen. And this is in New York. This is New York State in America. Now, you wouldn't think you get megalithic sites up there, but there's a huge amount of megalithic dolmens, stone circles, and chambers throughout New England, from New York upwards all the way up to Canada. And I checked out about 30 of these when I was there about 3 or 4 years ago. This just shows you a magnetic anomaly reading on the bottom left there, which shows clearly how the energy was present at that particular site. And you can clearly see it in the graphic there, how it's almost like there's a great bit of iron placed at the bottom, buried like 20 feet below. And this would give a reason for that kind of magnetic anomaly. And the dolmens, again, they're not just in New York State, they're all over the planet. I even think we found one at one of the sites Michael took me to the other day. I can't remember the name of it. I'll have to get him to mention that at the end of the talk. But it looked like a dolmen. And this is also a place where Andrew Collins found some pottery. And also there was some interesting earth energy accumulations at that particular point. These are some other dolmens. For example, on the top left, you've got ones in Wales. On the right, you've got France, Tunisia, Jordan. But these are all over the planet. For example, there were 19,000 dolmens just in Korea, in the Far East. These are some of the ones from America, again, showing these light effects. And again, on the right-hand side, you can see a map of the magnetic anomaly there. And these are yet more photos. All these chambers I seem to get orb photographs at. And all the tests that were taken out by John Burke and others found that there were magnetic anomalies here, and there were changes in the geology which would cause these effects. Similar things at Stonehenge, for instance. The white areas inside Stonehenge, forget the black sort of windy path on the left-hand side of the screen there. And actually, you can actually see the white effect in the ground that comes in through the entrance on the top right. Actually, all the energy seems to come in that way and circulate around the stones, as though they've controlled these telluric or these earth energies to have this effect. And again, there's magnetic anomalies present in this area. Avebury's the same. There's magnetic anomalies there picked up within the stones. They've realized that all the stones at Avebury, which is pretty much the largest stone circle in the world, next to the one in Morocco that Robert Temple mentioned, all these stones are magnetically aligned to each other precisely as though they were placed as a kind of clock, sort of pointing to one another in this great stone circle. Now, the reason for that is unknown, but it seems like it was used as an ancient device to charge energy of some sort. You get the same principles happen in Tiwanaku. I went into the Akapana, the main pyramid at Tiwanaku, went in there with a compass, went mentally, it was spinning around, basically. So we know that is built on, you can just test with your compasses, that was definitely built on a magnetic anomaly. And there's been research done by a guy called Philip Callahan in the 1970s and 80s. And he found that the round towers of ancient Ireland, there's hundreds of these round towers, you can see in the middle graphic there. And they were placed all around, and he believed that they attracted cosmic energy from the cosmos, basically, and drew it into the earth. That would actually help fertilize the landscape, and it would increase the growth of crops. And there's legends and stories associated with this that go back into the history of ancient Ireland. So again, we're really seeing that all over the world and different cultures, different eras, before the use of fertilizer and agrochemicals and things like this, it was actually an ancient way of fertilizing the landscape, fertilizing ourselves, and keeping ourselves in good health just by using the natural energies which were being harnessed by the ancients at these particular sites. These are some of the scientific effects and research that was carried out by John Burke. On the top left there, you can see these were some carried out in one of the rock chambers in New England. On the left, you can see he put basically a threefold increase in yield after the seeds of this plant or this crop had been placed inside the chamber. So they did lots of different tests. They put it inside the chamber for like an hour or sometimes 3 or 4 hours. But sometimes the energy was so strong in these ancient sites that they would actually burn out the seeds and kind of destroy them. So they had to work out the right time for them. And when they kind of realized that there's different lengths of time, you put the seeds in these chambers for slightly different effects. And when he went to plant them, often the minimum he would get was a double yield and a 40% growth increase. Usually it would be a triple yield, and there would be often 100% growth increase. And the way he discovered this is absolutely fascinating, because he was actually a scientific crop circle researcher, and he noticed that where crop circles had appeared and then it had been cut down, the year after, when the crops were regrowing, where the crop circle had been, they grew better. All the wheat, corn, whatever it was, it grew stronger in the area where the crop circle had been, as though some kind of energy had charged up that particular part of the landscape and that particular area of crop. So there's something going on here with these energies, not only with the ancient people who were working with it, but also with the mysterious makers of the crop circles themselves. So there's something very strange here, and it's all being rediscovered now. Potentially what they've discovered here as well, which is very important, is that you can forget GM, genetically modified crops. This is the way to do it now. This is the way. You can do it yourself, build your own sacred sites, or use sites that are already present there. Work out how to charge your seeds up and go and place them and grow them yourself. And you're going to get 3 or 4 times as much yield, faster growth rate. Often the crops become frost resistant, and they're just much stronger and more healthy. And obviously they're organic. And this is what has been going on in prehistory for thousands of years. That's how we got here today. So this whole idea of genetically modified crops is just so backwards. I just do not understand it. When we've got this technology, has been rediscovered over the last 5 years. And the timing of this rediscovery is important. And I think there's something in this we have to explore. On the bottom there, the 2 images across the bottom, which just show you the different types of crop that were planted and tested on one of the pyramids in Tikal in Guatemala. On the left there, you have the controls, and on the right there, you have the samples that are actually placed on top of the Lost World Pyramid. And when they tested, again, they got much higher yield and higher results when they placed them on top of this particular pyramid. So it also works on pyramids as well. It also works on different types of ancient sites. And when they tested the same seeds on the later pyramids, which were built by the Mayans, Nothing happened. There was no difference. Often it was worse because they were often built for political reasons. They weren't built for the ancient reasons. They were building these ancient sites, which was to work with the energies, which was to work with this fertilizing energy. And I think this is what got lost even in history. You know, it's only just being rediscovered today. This next image shows you some of these megalithic spirals that again seem to occur all around the planet. They've been found in Tiwanaku in Bolivia, like I mentioned yesterday, but also obviously throughout Europe and other sites in Malta and others. And the interesting thing about these, this is how the earth energy seems to appear and seems to work through the land. It goes around in spirals and goes around in different types of frequencies. And you can kind of control them. And this is something that geomancers have picked up. And so I think this is some kind of symbolic representation of these particular energies that we've been discussing. And most recently, which aligns very well with the work of Philip Callahan and John Burke, is modern research that's been happening in Russia and Ukraine. And they've built these artificial pyramids and out of simple designs, placed them at different places on the landscape, and just fascinating results have been coming from them. For example, when they did lots of tests with seeds and different things and different types of water and healing effects, and on the list on the left you can see clearly some of the examples. For example, water wouldn't freeze in the pyramid. There was increased electrical resistivity of carbon and silicon, increased strength of concrete. Radar detected the column of ionized plasma rising 1,000 feet. 20 seed types that were put in there for 1 to 5 days reached a 20 to 100% growth increase. There was also increased resistance in mice who had salmonella and tumors, so there's definitely a healing effect. And also there was a 4-fold increase in yield in surrounding wheat fields. Granite became charged, and they found that the charged granite could be taken out to different farms, and actually the energy of that would increase the yield and strength of the energies there and the crops there. And extinct flowers even returned after 20 years of being extinct. And so we're seeing some amazing effects here from just building these simple pyramids, which are based upon the golden phi ratio. Anyway, so we're seeing that there's not just energies we're dealing with here. Earlier on in the talk, we looked at this idea of a great survey done in antiquity, which is probably redone and rejigged from the maritime civilization of ancient peoples. But I believe that this energy system as well that we looked at was actually a global phenomenon, and they were sharing this worldwide. And now we're at this point where all this knowledge is coming back. And one of the other aspects which has been overlooked by many researchers is the idea that actually the grid, we are the grid, we're part of it, we're part of this energy system. It's actually our energies that kind of makes this grid sort of function. And so there has to be a human element. And there's been many different ideas and different projects linking people up at the same time all around the planet at different grid points, and actually re-energizing this grid, not only for our own spiritual advancement, but also for the benefit of the planet and for the benefit of the landscape itself. So, thank you very much for listening to me. Cheers.